So welcome and take it away, Professor Kendrick.
Thank you, Nora, and good afternoon and greetings. It's nice to be back in CUNY space, seeing some familiar names and faces. I'm Curtis Kendrick, University Libraries faculty and staff mentor at Binghamton University. Up until September of last year, I was Dean of Libraries at Binghamton, and before that, University Dean for Libraries at CUNY. I would like to thank LACUNY and the program committee for inviting me to speak with you today. You know, from my time at CUNY, I have a pretty good sense of many of the challenges of working at CUNY, and I know it's not an easy environment. So thank you for your contributions, the contributions you are making under very challenging circumstances, and thank you for your time and attention. Today, I would like to talk about race and racism in academic libraries and what our profession has been doing about it. More specifically, I'm hoping to cover these topics: race and racism in libraries and why that is different from diversity, whiteness and white privilege and white supremacy. It's impossible to talk meaningfully about race without talking about whiteness, white privilege, and white supremacy. Microaggressions, those are often how interpersonal racism is manifest in libraries. We'll take a look at some projections for library racial demographics looking out to the year 2033. And we'll spend a little bit of time talking about what the profession is doing regarding recruitment and retention, including a program being planned by CUNY, Binghamton, and Rutgers. I'll offer some thoughts about the MLS degree as a requirement for many library positions. Then we'll wrap up and leave some time for questions, comments, and discussion. As I said, I want to talk about race this afternoon. I was on sabbatical last fall semester and spent the time speaking with leading scholars and practitioners in the area of race and academic libraries. As library faculty and staff, I think it's important for us to understand significant trends in our industry, and I think this is a significant one. So today, I would like to present a perspective that would be consistent with what a lot of the people I spoke with have had to say or written about. Now, it's been my experience that talking about race can be uncomfortable for many people, and some get very defensive about it. I found that the number one reason for discomfort in talking about race is that people are afraid of saying the wrong thing or using terminology that is not current. For this session today, let's relax about this and assign the best of intentions to whatever anyone might say. Can we do that? Anyway, here at CUNY, you've done some good work in advancing equity, so there's really no need to get defensive. In terms of positionality, in some ways, I come from privilege. I was born in Queens, and my father was a physician, a child psychiatrist, who specialized in treating children of Holocaust survivors. My mother was a chemistry major at Fisk University and HBCU in Nashville. I have three sisters. My eldest sister just retired from a career as a corporate attorney. The next one is a family practice physician outside Atlanta. And my younger sister also works in the public sector, but in New York City. When I was young, we lived in a predominantly Black neighborhood in Queens. Then we moved to Long Island, to a white, predominantly Jewish neighborhood in 1965, when I was in the second grade. This was right back in the time of the civil rights era. Ours was the third Black family to move into the village of Great Neck Estates. It only felt like we were under constant observation, because we were. I consider myself an integration survivor. I graduated from Great Neck South High School, often considered in the top 1% of public high schools in the nation. I attended private universities, Brown for my undergraduate history degree, then Simmons for the MLS, and Emory for an MBA degree. And I've worked at predominantly white institutions my entire career, a mix of public and private schools. Now, my experience is perhaps atypical. Most Black people will not have had the opportunities that I've been afforded, because maybe economically we were upper middle class. More to the point, by the time I got my first librarian job at Oberlin College, I'd had a good 18 years of performative whiteness. It was second nature. And this has played a non-trivial role in whatever success I've had as a librarian working in predominantly white institutions. So about race. Unless we think the walls of our library somehow protect us from societal forces such as racism, discrimination, prejudice, and bias, then our academic libraries are not immune from these forces, and we need to be talking about them. As we get started, there are a few observations that frame this preservation that might be worth sharing. The civil rights affirmative action era of the 60s, 70s didn't solve everything. Arguably, integration was actually destructive to the Black community. Things like systemic racism, institutional racism, and white supremacy are real, even if not everyone can see them, experience them, or admit to them. Libraries are not, have never been, and have no way of being neutral. And being colorblind is not a virtue. I'll share some projections that show we are on track to make very little progress with representational diversity over the next 10 years. And then to make progress in this work, we must be prepared to upset people. The work is inherently about change, specifically about the transfer of power, and will materially alter the dynamics of our organizational cultures. So we have to talk about race, and to be clear, race, not diversity. Diversity is much more fun. Diversity initiatives speak of many things, but very rarely about racial justice or historical and ongoing racial oppression. We all like to celebrate our multiculturalism and think about inclusivity, but this is often at the expense of having open, honest conversations about race. We in libraries have lots of conversations about diversity and too few about racism, so fundamental problems never get addressed. To me, diversity can mean just about anything anyone wants it to mean, while racism is very explicit. It's clear what's under discussion. For one, when we're talking about race, we're talking about power and power relationships and long histories of subjugation and oppression. So what exactly is racism? The Dismantling Racism Workbook suggests that racism is when the power elite of one group has the power to carry out systematic discrimination through the institutional policies and practices of the society, while shaping the cultural beliefs and values that support those racist policies and practices. And along with this definition, they offer 4 equations to illustrate the point. Stephen Roberts from the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity at Stanford and Michael Rizzo from the Psychology Department at NYU have identified 7 factors that contribute to American racism. As far as categories, people see races, not individuals. Early on, children start categorizing according to race. Racial biases emerge in children as young as 3 years old. With factions, the authors suggest, people treat their own race like a team. Factions trigger in-group loyalty and intergroup competition and threat. People separate themselves on the basis of race. Segregation hardens racist perceptions, preferences, and beliefs. White Americans are granted a status above all others. The hierarchy emboldens white people to think, feel, and behave in racist ways. There is a power imbalance across races. White Americans have the power to set norms and structure society. As far as the media, white Americans are portrayed as superior to Americans of color. The media legitimize overrepresented and idealized versions of white Americans while marginalizing and minimizing people of color. Passivism means overlooking or denying the existence of racism and encouraging others to do the same. We used to think there was a biological component to race, but modern-day genetics have disproven this. The American Association of Physical Anthropology notes that race, while not a scientifically accurate biological concept, can have important biological consequences because of the effects of racism. And they offer the belief in races as natural aspects of human biology and the structures of inequality, racism, that emerge from such beliefs are among the most damaging elements in the human experience, both today and in the past. Since science now tells us that race is a social construct, this leads some to the conclusion that race isn't real, and therefore we should ignore it, treat everyone the same, be colorblind. In striving to be colorblind, however, we negate the quotidian reality that for people of color, race is a real factor in our lives. While race may not be biologically determined, that doesn't mean that it isn't real in a social context. Ruth Frankenberg contends that race was invented approximately 500 years ago, as marked by the moment when race was made into a difference and simultaneously into a rationale for racial inequity. This line of thought holds that white people created race as a justification for the race-based system of slavery that evolved in much of the country from the colonial era until the passing of the 13th Amendment. Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, establishes a through line in the United States, from slavery to Jim Crow to our current regime of mass incarceration. To be clear, racism is not exclusively acts by individuals. When we define racism as the person in the white sheet with a torch, it's easy to see we aren't that and conclude, therefore, we aren't racist. The scholar Eduardo Bonilla Silva coined the phrase racism without racist. And what he is speaking of is more commonly referred to as systemic racism or institutional racism. Individual racism and institutional racism have distinct properties. What does institutional or systemic racism look like? The reality is, it is a system that is normalized in our society to the point that it is often unrecognized. Systemic racism is real and experienced by people within your organization, even if you yourself can't see it. Here are just a few examples of what systemic racism might look like in a library. As far as assimilation, the need for new faculty and staff to assimilate is very true of libraries. The culture doesn't change because of new entrants. We touched on defensive reactions. We touched on focusing on things like diversity and multiculturalism. Eurocentricity, quiet, conflict averse, these also describe how a lot of our libraries operate. As far as spaces celebrating whiteness, the federal government has now decided to finally take down the portrait of Confederate General Robert E. Lee from the library at West Point. There's also a financial aspect to systemic racism. For example, requiring reimbursement for job interview expenses rather than paying up front, or when conference attendance is required for advancement, but we don't fully support it financially. And then some library jobs certainly require prior library service, but we often use this as a criterion for the convenience of the search committee as a filter. Later, I'll talk about the role of the MLS degree. So whiteness, white privilege, and white supremacy. To some extent, whiteness and white privilege and white supremacy are the elephant in the room we would just as soon not talk about. However, as Espinal has indicated, unless we address whiteness, unless we identify and name it, many of the problems that plague us collectively and as individual librarians of color will continue. She goes on to say, North American mainstream white culture is not accustomed to looking at whiteness or recognizing its very existence. In contemporary everyday speech and written white discourse, it is indeed considered impolite and racist to discuss such a concept. Yet it's impossible to talk meaningfully about race without talking about whiteness, white privilege, and white supremacy. A very basic challenge is the need for white people generally to understand and accept that they have a racial perspective. The fact of being white is a factor in their individual personalities, and there is something that we can call a white perspective that influences, to a lesser or greater extent, the thoughts and behaviors of individual white people. As with other racial groups, it's a continuum, and the strength and exact nature of how the influence becomes manifest will vary from person to person and over time for an individual. April Hathcock comments that the normativity of whiteness works insidiously, invisibly, to create binary categorizations of people as either acceptable to whiteness and therefore normal, or different and therefore other. The invisible nature of whiteness is key to its power. When it is not named or interrogated, it can persist in creating a culture of exclusion behind the scenes of LIS practice. One key aspect of whiteness in academic libraries is the lack of diversity among library staff. For example, nationally, 80+% of librarians identify as white. This lack of diversity can lead to a culture within the library that is not inclusive or welcoming to people of color, and can result in the exclusion of diverse perspectives and experiences. Another way in which whiteness manifests in academic libraries is through the selection of materials for the collection. The publishing industry is largely dominated by white authors, white editors, white reviewers, and white corporate leadership, leading to a disproportionate representation of white voices and experiences in library collections. It's important to recognize and challenge the ways in which whiteness is perpetuated and upheld in academic libraries, and to work towards creating a more inclusive and equitable environment for all patrons. Here are some examples of how whiteness might manifest in an academic library setting. Here are some other examples of the ways in which library faculty and staff engage with patrons that can also be reflective of whiteness. In her seminal work, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, Peggy McIntosh defines white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets which I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. Writing in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, Phillips and Lowery at Stanford University found that when whites are exposed to evidence of white privilege, they claim more hardships in life than those who are not exposed to the evidence. These claims are motivated by feeling threatened and help whites deny that racial privilege extends to themselves. The hardship claims permit whites to deny that they personally benefit from privilege while accepting that group level, i.e. white people as a group, are beneficiaries of this inequity. Claiming hardships helps individuals discount the role of systemic privilege in their personal lives. The authors go on to note that this discounting of personal privilege is ultimately associated with diminished support for affirmative action policies, policies that could help reduce privilege and increase racial equity. In the late 1990s, Tema Okun developed a set of characteristics of white supremacist culture. These have recently been updated and are listed on her site, Divorcing White Supremacy Culture. As Okun states, one of the purposes of listing characteristics of white supremacy culture is to point out how organizations which unconsciously use these characteristics as their norms and standards make it difficult, if not impossible, to open the door to other cultural norms and standards. She continues, as a result, many of our organizations, while saying we want to be multicultural, actually only allow other people and cultures to come in if they adapt or conform to already existing cultural norms. These are the characteristics Okun has identified as being indicative of a white supremacy culture. White supremacy culture's #1 strategy is to make us afraid. Most of the characteristics listed here are driven by fear. White supremacy culture uses perfectionism to preserve power and the status quo. Thinking there's only one right way to accomplish a task is a white supremacy characteristic. Objectivity manifests as the belief that there is such a thing as being objective or neutral, that emotions are inherently destructive, irrational, and should not play a role in decision-making or group process. Qualified is how Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or BIPOC faculty and students, must navigate overt and subtle accusations of being admitted simply to satisfy an affirmative action requirement. The progress, bigger, more characteristics explore our cultural assumption that the goal is always to be, do, get more, and be, do, get bigger. This leads to an emphasis on what we can objectively measure. Similarly, with an emphasis on quantity, most or all resources are directed towards producing quantitatively measurable goals. Things that can be counted are more highly valued than things that cannot. Worship of the written word has nothing to do with the ability to write well. Whites just have more power to determine what the written words will be. For white people, individualism may show up as seeing yourself and or demanding to be seen as an individual and not as part of the white group. I'm the only one is an aspect of individualism when people feel that if something is going to get done right, I have to do it. Defensiveness and denial reflect our cultural dis-ease with truth-telling, particularly when we are speaking truth to power. White supremacy culture encourages a habit of silence about things that matter. Right to comfort is the belief that those with power have a right to emotional and psychological comfort. You may have heard the phrase white tears. This is the kind of thing it refers to. Urgency reinforces the idea that we are ruled by time, deadlines, and needing to do things in a timely way, often based on arbitrary schedules that have little to do with the actual realities of how long things take. The reality of systemic racism and white privilege and white supremacy should not suggest that interpersonal racism has gone away. Many instances of individual racist behavior directed at people of color take the form of microaggressions. Microaggressions can be defined as verbal or behavioral slights, generally subtle and often unintentional or unconscious, that communicate a stereotype or negative attitude toward a person of color, and thus indicate an implicit bias based on race. Microaggressions are often how interpersonal racism is expressed in libraries. Professor Daryl Wing Su at Columbia and colleagues have developed a taxonomy relating to microaggressions, in which 3 forms of microaggressions are deployed: microassaults, microinsults, and microinvalidations. Oops. Jana Alibi's study of microaggressions in the LIS field showed statistically significant differences in who reported experiencing and or witnessing microaggressions between librarians of color and white librarians. 85% of librarians of color surveyed reported having experienced microaggressions, while very few white librarians had, and white librarians also had difficulty recognizing when microaggressions were occurring. For at least the last 35 years, academic libraries have been making a concerted effort to diversify their staff. I attended my first diversity in higher education conference in the late 1980s, and around the same time, a group of us at Stony Brook University established a minority internship program to attract undergraduates to librarianship. We are desperate to attract more people of color to the field, but who do we want? Highly intelligent, articulate people of color with impeccable academic credentials who don't make the white people nervous. Our theory as a profession is that increasing representation will lead to culture change within our libraries, making us better able to support our BIPOC students and faculty. as well as better able to recruit and retain library faculty and staff of color. We envision greater representation will make our libraries more welcoming to all and engender a greater sense of belonging for BIPOC faculty and students. Unfortunately, while we wait for the cavalry of librarians of color to inform our libraries and its services, year after year, groups of library users are underserved. There's evidence that the library experience for students of color differs from that of their white peers. Ethelene Whitmire notes that non-classroom environments, such as the academic library, can be unwelcoming for African-American college students. El Teto, Jackson, and Lim, in a study at Portland State University, found differences in the student experience of the library based on race. Students of color were much more lukewarm about whether or not they received good customer service at the reference desk when encountering a staff member of a different race or ethnicity. Students indicated that at times the facial expressions of the staff don't appear welcoming, and it was suggested that if the library had a more diverse staff, others might feel more comfortable talking to them. Moreover, students of color found the library was slightly less welcoming of them. They also felt less safe. In a study of the academic library experience of Native American students, Busey found that while browsing library collections, Native American students encounter problematic and even racist terminology and organization. Notably, Native students identified these problems while their non-Native peers did not. John Jay's Marta Bladek asserts that in order to implement changes that would effectively improve the library experience for Latino students, it is crucial to start by acknowledging that longtime services do not adequately meet their needs. Finally, a 2020 study of the library experience at Duke found that Black students do not feel as safe from discrimination, harassment, and emotional and physical harm as white students when using the libraries. Some respondents indicated engaging with staff and feeling uncomfortable about the tone of the interaction, describing them with phrases such as talking down to and reluctant to assist. Given the differential between the experience of students of color and white students in academic libraries, it is important for the profession to redouble its effort to attract people of color to librarianship. Our ultimate goal is not increasing the number of BIPOC librarians, but rather for its implications for providing better and more accommodating services, collections, programs, and spaces. I'd like to pivot now and talk about numbers and data for a while. Librarianship has been grappling with an underrepresentation of BIPOC librarians for decades, and despite a plethora of initiatives, the numbers appear to have not changed meaningfully, despite all the good intentions. In 2006, the American Library Association launched an initiative to measure the demographics of the profession, Diversity Counts. Diversity Counts was last updated with data from 2009-2010. Here, we see the projection of whites constituting 88% of librarians nationally at that time, with relatively low participation rates for other races or ethnicities. In May 2005, ALA launched a member survey to study race, among other demographic factors. The organization released a report in 2017, presenting data from 2017 and compared it to data from 2014. The demographic percentages are consistent across the two surveys, with changes of less than 1 percentage point across all categories. While the member survey may have reflected the demographics of ALA members, most working librarians are not members of ALA. ALA membership is also not exclusive to librarians, as ALA members include trustees, publishers, and others. And given the membership dues and the tight correlation between wealth and race, these data may not be fully representative of the field as a whole. In spite of the limitations, the actual reported figures tightly align with the data from Diversity Counts a few years earlier. Turning to data sources outside of the profession, the current population survey, produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, issues monthly demographic profiles of the current state of the workforce including statistics for librarians and media specialists. The percentage of white librarians has remained about the same since 2017, when the public reports first included data broken out by race and ethnicity. The ALA and the CPS data tell a consistent and compelling story. Historically, the percentage of white librarians has remained about the same for the last decade or more, despite our efforts and interventions to de-whiten the library profession. It begs the question, how much progress are we making? And more to the point, how much progress are we on track to make? While considering multiple variables and making a host of assumptions, it is possible to project out data from various sources and model the projected racial demographics of the profession into the early 2030s. Arwana Holbert from Ithaca SNR and I recently published an Ithaca issue brief by any measure, the racial demographics of librarians. For this work, Arwana was in communication with people at the Bureau of Labor Statistics and found that in addition to the data released publicly, there were data files available, including some that provide a different approach to the calculations, so the numbers are different from what is presented to the public. We ran models based on the public CPS data, revised non-public CPS data, a 10-year average of the revised non-public data, and the information reported through diversity counts. Looking at the most current public CPS data released by BLS, for example, they estimate there were 158,231 librarians, library media specialists in the US, and that 85.69% of them are white. With what the profession is doing now, the status quo, projecting the anticipated growth rate in employed librarians and predictions of new entrants to the profession and those leaving the profession, by the early 2030s, it is estimated that the percentage of white librarians will have dropped to 82.54% with the CPS model. This would represent a change of just over 3 percentage points over a 10-year period. Similarly, modeling the ALA diversity counts data, we found that the profession is on track to go from 87.97% white to 83.07% white by 2033. The non-public CPS data are somewhat better, with projections of 80.09% and 78.67% white in 10 years. Exclusively as an exercise, and not to suggest any quota or target, we explored what it would take for the profession to be only 75% white at the end of the period. For the CPS public data model, there would need to be an additional 1,100 BIPOC MLS students graduating every year for the next 10 years to get from a projected future state of 82.54% white down to 75.41% white. As another example, modeling based on the 10-year averages for the non-public CPS data suggests there would need to be an additional 500 BIPOC MLS students graduating every year for the next 10 years to get the profession down to 75.51% white. Currently, there are about 1,250 BIPOC MLS graduates per year across the country. Attracting an additional 500 to 1,100 new BIPOC librarians per year is setting a high bar, a challenge we are unlikely to rise to meet. The other scenarios lead to other unlikely results. Is there anything we are doing as a profession to identify and recruit an additional 500 to 1,100 BIPOCs per year to librarianship every year for the next 10 years? Our existing professional interventions to aid in BIPOC recruitment and retention would not approach this. It's clear that our solutions do not scale to the magnitude of the problem. So what have we been doing as a profession? Examples abound of library organizations attempting to address the problem of diversity in the LIS field. Many initiatives have been developed over the years, including a host of diversity residency programs, such as the first one developed at the University of Delaware in the 1980s. Other examples of initiatives in LAS to advance racial equity include the American Library Association Spectrum Scholarship Program and their Diversity Research Grant Program. The Association of College and Research Libraries runs the ACRL Diversity Alliance Program, which focuses on increasing the pipeline for hiring people from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. The Association of Research Libraries offers the Kaleidoscope Program and a Leadership and Career Development Program. And there is the Minnesota Institute for Early Career Librarians. Also, since 2011, a consortium of universities offering graduate degrees in information or library science have been offering the iSchool Inclusion Institute, I3. I3 is a leadership development program targeted to undergraduate students from underrepresented populations. Hosted by the University of Texas, I3 prepares students for graduate school and careers in the information sciences. Despite decades of good intentions and interventions, we are not on a path to any meaningful acceleration in the number of BIPOC librarians relative to their white peers. This recognition is not a call to stop any of the programs currently planned or in place, rather a reality check to advocate for new approaches to a perennial problem. It's time for new approaches. Our racial equity challenges won't change until we change. We need to develop bridge strategies while we continue to work to figure out solutions to fulfill our BIPOC recruitment and retention objectives. The Association of Research Libraries has received an IMLS grant to develop a leadership institute emphasizing diversity, equity, and inclusion. Just recently, UCLA announced the Radical Librarian Institute, sponsored by their School of Education and Information Studies. Another new approach is a project in development that Binghamton University is working on with Rutgers and CUNY to develop an anti-racism immersive summer program to better equip academic library workers to support BIPOC students and faculty on their campuses. The anti-racism immersion program will be an intensive 2-week hybrid program intended to enable academic library workers to develop the skills and expertise necessary to provide better library services and collections to students and faculty of color on their campuses. The immersion program will also emphasize organizational change, as the systemic cultural changes necessary within our libraries require commitment at the organizational level. Given our demographics, the anti-racism immersion program is expected to attract many professionals who identify as white. And we take the position that for change such as dismantling white supremacy to occur in our academic libraries, the locus of that change must of necessity be situated within the white community. If people of color could dismantle white supremacy, it would have been done a long time ago. Finally, it's necessary to reconsider the use of the MLS as a gatekeeper to the profession, as it works to suppress BIPOC availability to serve in libraries. We want to diversify our ranks, but as we've seen, we can't MLS our way out of our diversity problems. There are conflicting priorities: the need to diversify our libraries and our seeming inability to accept anything other than the MLS degree as the entry point for the rewards and riches of a fully realized career working in a library. We might consider which positions actually require an MLS, and can there be a way for non-MLS library employees to chart a career path without having to leave our organizations or the field of librarianship? The MLS has value, but is it needed for all the positions we now require it for, or can we construct more positions that don't require it? Many years ago, Jim Neal, then vice president and university librarian at Columbia, gave a talk at an ACRL national meeting at which he advanced the concept of the feral library professional, essentially professionals with specializations other than librarianship, who we accept into our domain and then inculcate with our values and our ways. But more than just accept them, there needs to be an upward mobility path for them that incentivizes them to keep working in the library. Loosening our reluctance to share power with people with other professional expertise, as well as with BIPOC librarians themselves, will expand our concept of who holds sanctioned positions of power and leadership. For decades, we've been ineffectively struggling with how to increase BIPOC librarian representation in our libraries, but the numbers aren't changing. Moreover, representational diversity is just a first step in an ongoing journey to create library spaces and cultures that are actively anti-racist and more equitable and just. It may be that we need to change our organizational cultures before we can attract more people of color to the field. In the meanwhile, we need to continue to look for ways to improve our capacity to provide services for our students and faculty of color. The limit to how much progress we can make in fighting racism is the degree to which white people generally can understand and take responsibility for their racial history, privilege, and future. Frederick Douglass said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing the ground." To make progress in this work, we have to be prepared to upset people. The work is inherently about change, specifically about the transfer of power, and will materially alter the dynamics of organizational culture. There will be pushback and resistance from many corners as we engage in this work, and conceivably pressure from places external to the library. We have to persevere, taking the next right action in the face of this opposition. The work is generational. There are no quick fixes or easy answers. We didn't get to where we are overnight, and the solution path will be long and arduous. Still, if you think about it, we are talking about our library services and collections, so ultimately, it's a familiar role for us, advocating on behalf of our patrons. Imagine all of our patrons feeling a sense of welcome and belonging in our academic libraries. Let's get to work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's a lot of food for thought and a lot of great history in there. We have about 15 minutes for questions and discussion. And that's definitely makes space for non-white attendees to speak first, if that's okay with the audience here. And again, this is being recorded, so if you'd not like to be on video, then you can keep your cameras off. So you can either ask questions in the chat or raise your hands. Okay, I've got iPhone 6 with a hand up. Sorry, I don't have a.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, this is Ray Pun. I'm just on my phone. I'm going to change it now. But I just want to say thank you, Curtis, for your thoughtful presentation, because it's more of a comment. 10 years ago, I applied for a position, sort of a leadership role, and I didn't get it, but I remember having an interaction with you, talking about it after, like a couple of years after, and you still encouraged me. So I just wanted to give you a shout out for just being supportive, right? Even though for folks like me who might be interested early in a career, you were just there, and so I just wanted to recognize that. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for bringing that up.
Thanks, Ray. Isabel?
Hey, hi, Curtis. Nice to see you.
Hey, Isabel.
I'm just gonna say something that I wrote on the Ithaca blog. I totally agree with opening up how we think of librarian jobs and the qualifications required. But I also want to say that if you don't, you can do that and still have the same result we're having now if people don't change their mindset when applicants apply. So you can just get more white people who don't have the MLS. You can get a lot more white librarians who, have another master's degree or some other thing if the mindset doesn't change. So I just want to say that because I hear a lot of people saying that we have to stop requiring the MLS. But I totally agree with that. And I don't know which one comes first. Do you change the racism and then bring people in, or do you bring people in and that will change it because there'll be so many more of us? I agree with you that we have to do both of those things.
Yeah, it's sort of a chicken and an egg problem. I think it's going to be continue to be hard for us to recruit and retain people of color in the profession until our organizational cultures change. So, I mean, just, you know, to use the way you set it up, I would say the racism has to change first before we're able to be more successful in recruiting.
You know what, Curtis, I've said I can't hold my breath for that. I feel like
Yeah.
we have to do both. Yeah, thank you. I'll let the next person go.
Dr. Elise Jordan?
Oh, I have my mic on. Thank you very much for the presentation today. I felt like you were articulating a lot of the things that I'm feeling. I've been a librarian for 20 plus years in higher education. I have, you know, multiple library degrees. I have a total of 5. But I find in my day-to-day work that it is the microaggressions that are hindering me in my daily work as well as in my promotions. And it's like literally I have to move to get my next leadership position. And retention, as an African-American librarian, I'm not sure why I stay, and I was thinking about that today, but I do love what I do. But I just want to say thank you so very much for your articulate way of expressing the things that I feel.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Yeah, Sarah Ponte?
Yes, thank you so much. Hello, Mr. Curtis. Kendrick.
Sarah.
Hi, I'm so happy to see you, and thank you so much for that thoughtful presentation. It is hard for us as, for example, immigrants and people of color in this profession. We don't see many of us, but it is increasing slowly, and we can be, as Isabel was saying, we can be part of that. And the support, for example, I remember when you were the CUNY librarian. Remember when you used
Dean for Libraries, yeah.
Exactly, Dean of Libraries, thank you. And because of you and your support, even though you didn't know it at that time, the Dominican Institute was able to get into the work catalog. So making sure that others are included, that's part of our jobs. And I understand that it is harder to get to positions, but you just have to do what you need to do. In my department, there were only 3 white men as full professors. And I said, why? No, that needs to change. And I began finding out the information and also the mentoring that I got and the support. And working as hard as I could, I am a full professor now. So yes, so we can do this if we unite and we collaborate with each other. And of course, we're not saying that white people are bad, not at all. I have a lot of white people that collaborate with me. So that's important also to highlight that it depends on the mentality and the how inclusive you are. So thank you so much. And it's nice to see you. You look so young.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, thank you. We're all happy to see you, Curtis. Nicole?
Good afternoon. I really appreciated your talk, and it sort of, I mean, I think these are conversations that I have with a lot of my, I'm a librarian at CUNY School of Medicine, and these are the kinds of conversations I have with my librarian friends, often of color, but not only, but sort of maybe tenure track faculty and sort of younger librarians. And these are sort of the kinds of things that we think of. I personally really, like obviously, if you're serious about wanting an equitable institution for not only the students that we serve, but also the people who work in the libraries, these are the kinds of considerations that people need to talk about. Like I've been calling library school a scam since I graduated from it. I appreciate the skills that I have, but I don't think it needed to be a 2-year program. It didn't need to be a master's. And a lot of what I learned as a librarian is stuff I picked up at the different libraries I worked at. And this is a huge barrier to entry for a lot of really qualified, thoughtful, smart people who would bring so much to libraries. And it's, I don't know, sorry, I just have a lot of thoughts about this. And yeah, unpaid internship, yep, I did one of those as well. And it only worked because I could live with my parents. I never could have, gone to library school. I went to a state school, but I wouldn't have been able to afford like a private American library school and then somewhere to live on my own and, working at the same time. I know this. And finally, the thing about diversity residencies, I applied for one at this point. It's been like 16 years. So I don't know what sort of the thought processes of application for applying, but when I applied for one, I was basically told that my story wasn't sad enough to qualify me because I was like from the suburbs. And
I'm sorry.
no, it's serious. They were like, can you tell us of a situation? The last question, I think it had gone really well, but the last question in the interview is like, can you tell us of a time where like your race, you suffered really, you had a bad experience because of a race or a disability. And I'm like, there were definitely times in my life that things felt like, racism, but overall, I would never say that I had been like set back or, publicly discriminated against or anything like tragic.
And did you find that in that situation, there was an aspect of them judging the quality of your hardship? Like,
absolutely.
well, that wasn't so bad. That couldn't have been so bad.
No, that's it.
So,
They
but,
didn't feel bad enough for me. Like I wasn't giving them the trauma porn they were looking for.
Yeah, exactly.
And, at the time I didn't know the term microaggression. I just knew that I wasn't sad enough for them to pick me. And the person they did pick had like an appropriately like really great story of overcoming something. But, the thing that really, besides that was the only question that I answered in a way I could tell they didn't like. And the thing that made me not get this was because, they talked to me and they didn't feel like, I was tragic enough to highlight as a person who got this. So, I mean, I guess it probably all worked out. I didn't want to live.
I was going to say, you might be better off not having gotten that to be.
Yeah, I mean, now, but I was just so sad because I could hear the moment when my answer wasn't sad enough that the whole temperature like changed and everyone was like very abrupt and like, thank you very much. And, after we'd been like chatting for an hour. So it was just jarring because I never expected that, that was what they were looking for. They said it was supposed to be about like diversifying the librarian position, librarianship, but really they just wanted someone to like, I don't know, they wanted to show like, look what we've done. We've raised this person up from like nothing. And I wasn't.
They wanted a charity case.
Yeah. And so it's just, and, I don't know. I think people don't know what to expect sometimes when they see a Black librarian and they do maybe think that's, I don't know. It's just so weird when it comes to race in library. Sometimes it totally doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter so much that it feels like it takes you off guard when it does. So I don't know. It's just a lot to process being a librarian in CUNY in New York at this time.
Great comments. Thanks.
Any other questions, comments, or ideas for how to change the very problematic figures that Curtis presented to us? I'll wait a long Zoom pause. Yeah, Isabel, go ahead.
I just want to say what I put in the comments in the chat in case Curtis can't see it, which is that I really appreciate that you're taking an analysis and you're looking at what is being done now is not going to get us to where we want to go. So we have to do something different. And I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, I just really don't want people to think that we've somehow solved this problem and that it's all going to be great and just around the corner it's going to be wonderful. That's not the road we're on.
So in the chat, I don't know if this is a speculative question, Jean. What would it take in CUNY to change the MLIS requirements, and maybe just in general, if you have thoughts about the kind of first steps to move in that direction? I know you talked a little bit about the idea of people who have diverse experience in other fields or are already working in libraries and have a lot of the applied knowledge when there just isn't a path forward. I don't know if you have other thoughts in response to that. I mean, it's a big question.
Yeah, it's a huge question. You know, I think that we need to look at our jobs and kind of deconstruct them and reconfigure them in ways that don't require the MLS, or many of our jobs, some of our jobs at least. And one part of this, though, is trying to hold on to these folks who we've brought in who aren't librarians, but they're really, you know, doing a great job. They might even be superstars in your organization, but they're capped. There's no place for them to go. You know, they aren't going to move into, you know, managerial positions in the library because they don't have the MLS degree. And, you know, maybe that's as it should be, but it seems like there are a lot of downsides to it that we haven't really taken into full account.
Well, thanks so much, everyone. I think we're almost at time. If there's any last thoughts, feel free to speak up. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone's like, hey, it's nice to see you. So it's nice to see you. And a lot of CUNY faces in the room. If everybody wants to do a wave. Yeah, we miss you, Curtis.
That's nice.
Yeah, thanks for
Yeah,
joining
yeah.
us. Yeah.
Well, I miss you. I miss you all too. It's a pretty fantastic system. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Okay, bye.